Hello, podcast listeners. You are now listening to the Coffee, Health, and Science Podcast. I'm your host, Jordan River, and I want to thank you for tuning in yet again today. Before we get started, I urge you to share the show. Spread the show around. Tell a coffee lover. Tell someone who's interested in health science. We do appreciate the grassroots growth of the show. Make sure you're subscribed so you get a notification when we drop new episodes. And give a good rating and review if you could on your app, please. It does help us out. Today, it's another coffee history, just you and me in the studio today, and this episode is unlike any other one that we've done before in the past. It is primarily coffee history. It's part coffee societal commentary and a lot of gray area in between. We're discussing today the role of women in coffee history, or more accurately, one very famous event, simply known as the 1674 Women's Petition against coffee. This is something that has come up on the show before, I believe, and it's a very famous and contentious historical moment, and it could have possibly affected the future of coffee and coffee houses forever. Today, we are going all the way back to the 17th century to examine this fascinating moment in history, so let's dive right in. I want to begin by emphasizing something I've discussed before, the incredible role that coffee houses played in past cultures throughout history. We've mentioned how these coffee houses were havens for intellectual discussion and political dissent and free speech, but there really was much more action going on within those coffee house walls than just chatting. From gambling and stock trading to exhibitions and prostitution, coffee houses, depending on when and where you chose to visit one, were wild places. A blog called Res Obscure does an amazing job of describing this. Quote, "Imagine a space where you can bet on bear fights, warm your legs by the fire, witness public dissections, human and animal, solicit prostitutes, male and female, buy and sell stocks, purchase tulips or pornographic pamphlets, observe the activities of spies, dissidents, merchants, and swindlers, and then read your mail, delivered directly to your table. The thread tying it all together is a new drug from the Muslim world. Black, odoriferous, frightening, bewitching, called coffee. The 17th century coffee shop was an experimental social space whose closest correlate in the modern world is not a place at all. It's the internet. The main characteristic of 17th century coffee houses was the diversity of experiences and activities they harbored. Also, like the internet, the early modern coffee shop was deeply paradoxical. It was a haven for free speech, but also a target for the surveillance state. It was a place where different social classes mixed, but also one that enforced rigid gender rules. If they weren't serving drinks or working as prostitutes, women typically weren't allowed." End quote. Coffee and coffee culture embodied restriction and dissent in a lot of ways, especially in the Western world at this time. And like that quote said, a lot of that was due to the drink having its roots so deeply entrenched in Muslim culture. There was an inherent distrust of the drink in Christendom, and women were forbade from coffee shops. This did not sit well, of course, and what spawned from this gender segregation of coffee shops was the infamous pamphlet that we are focusing on today. And the title simply reads, "The Women's Petition Against Coffee. Representing to public consideration the grand inconveniencies accruing their sex from the excessive use of that drying, enfeebling liquor, presented to the Right Honorable the Keepers of the Libraries of VENVS, by a well-willer." That means an anonymous writer, a well-wisher, I assume. London, 1674. This pamphlet is wild, you guys. You can find the full text by Googling Women's Petition Against Coffee full text. It's 6 pages long in its original print, It is not brief, and some of the writing is just fascinating to look back on now. There is a lot of contention over the history behind this piece, which we will get to in just a moment, but first, I'm going to present it to you authentically at face value. Let's just read some of the content now, starting with the beginning. That since 'tis reckoned amongst the glories of our native country to be a paradise for women, the same in our apprehensions can consist in nothing more than the brisk activity of our men, who in former ages were justly esteemed the ablest performers in Christendom. But, to our unspeakable grief, we find of late a very sensible decay of that true old English vigor, our gallants being every way so Frenchified. I can't read this without laughing. It continues. Never did men wear greater breeches or carry less in them of any metal whatsoever. There was a glorious dispensation, 'twas surely in the golden age, when lusty lads of 700 or 800 years old got sons and daughters. And we have read how a prince of Spain was forced to make a law that men should not repeat the grand kindness to their wife above 9 times a night. But alas, alas, those forward days are gone. The dull lubbers want a spur now rather than a bridle, being so far from doing any works of supererogation that we find them not capable of performing those devoirs which their duty and our expectations exact. Oh my gosh, that was a mouthful. So basically, supposedly, these women are coming forth and saying that the coffee is making their men impotent, and how we all know back in the day, people used to have kids hundreds of years old, and Spain had to make a law about the grand kindness limiting 9 times a night. This is fascinating stuff. It continues later in the piece. For the continual sipping of this pitiful drink is enough to bewitch men of 2 and 20, and tie up the codpiece point without a charm. It renders them that use is as lean as famine, as rivelled as envy. I don't know what that word means. Or an old meager hag overridden by an incubus. They come from it with nothing moist but their snotty noses, nothing stiff but their joints, nor standing but their ears. My God. They pretend 'twill keep them waking, but we find by scurvy experience they sleep quietly enough after it. Wow. So these women are supposedly upset about the effect that coffee is having on their men, their libido, their sexual performance, but just in general, they paint the coffee houses like some sort of stimulant drug den. Towards the end of the piece, you can read, quote, men by frequenting these Stygian tap houses will usurp on our prerogative of tattling, and soon learn to exceal us in talkativeness, a quality wherein our sex has ever claimed preeminence. For here, like so many frogs in a puddle, they sup muddy water, and murmur insignificant notes, till 6 of them outbabble an equal number of us at a gossiping, talking all at once in confusion, and running from point to point, insensibly. End quote. The coffee propaganda here is epic. I like how in one breath they downplay the energy-boosting quality of coffee, saying they sleep soundly enough after. They say it keeps them awake, but they sleep soundly enough. But then in the next breath, they make them sound like babbling stimulant maniacs who can't put together a proper sentence. I really encourage you to take a look at this whole text if it interests you. It is quite fascinating, the old language. I'll finish it out here with just one more little piece from the end of the women's petition against coffee. Quote, we humbly pray that you, our trusty patrons, would improve your interest, that henceforth the drinking coffee may on severe penalties be forbidden to all persons under the age of 60, and that instead thereof, lusty nappy beer, cock ale, cordial canaries, restoring malagos, and back recruiting chocolate be recommended for general use throughout the territories. End quote. Wow, so they weren't looking to equalize the rights of access to coffee. Whoever wrote this is simply demonizing coffee, looking to stifle its popularity, as so many have done throughout history. Which leads me to my next point. As is so often the case, history is muddled and misunderstood frequently. The great Napoleon Bonaparte said, "History is a set of lies agreed upon." And that is reflected here as well. You see, many historians assert that this letter was not written by a woman at all. And if you dig into the tone and the meaning of the petition itself, that kind of makes sense. Historians assert that whoever wrote this letter did it for ulterior motives, taking the classic anti-coffee stance that Christendom often did. This was not a petition for women's rights. This was not a protest to advance women's standing in society. This was probably a fake letter written by a man to try and knock coffee down a peg in English society, or so many experts say. Smithsonian Magazine writes a great piece, and I'd like to quote a little bit of it here. Quote, "During these decades, the British monarchy had been deposed during the English Civil War when Charles I was executed in 1649, and restored when Charles II was placed on the throne in 1660. It was a time when politics was a huge and touchy subject for everyone in English society, and the new king, mindful of what happened to his father, was eager to promote a return to the old ways. Coffee houses, to the king and his supporters, represented a new form of sociability that rose up in the years while England had no king and should be stamped out. But in the 1600s, as today, it takes a lot to separate anyone from their coffee. There was probably never a genuine war of the sexes around coffee houses. For women, historian Markman Ellis writes, coffee houses offered a business opportunity. While it is true, as the satirists of the time wrote, that sex workers used coffee houses to solicit work, they were far from the only women there. A number of coffee houses were run by women, he writes, often widows, and women worked in them as servers and in other capacities. So there you have it. As usual, history is unclear and full of contradictions. But as the Smithsonian Magazine article title asserts, this 17th century women's petition against coffee probably wasn't about women or coffee. It probably wasn't written by angry, sex-deprived wives, although stranger things have happened. I like that subtitle that they chose there. And, of course, whether or not the petition was written authentically, the men had to respond. The men's response to the women's petition against coffee is even crazier. Of course, leave it to the men to take the bait and respond to something that's probably just a fabrication. You can go and read it. It gets quite graphic. I'm going to read one line because it quickly gets into graphic territory. This one is a doozy. But it starts, quote, "Could it be imagined that ungrateful women, after so much laborious drudgery, both by day and night, and the best of our blood and spirits spent in your service, you should thus publicly complain?" End quote. That's literally how it starts. Wow. I mean, listen, this battle of the sexes is nothing new, but I absolutely love this exploration and learning more about how people behaved in this time and how coffee and coffee houses played into society so deeply. It's crazy. And of course, in the men's response, they go on to say how the English men, give their wives the best grand kindness, if you will. And it's really funny. These pamphlets were like the Twitter wars of the 17th century. Quite wild. But as usual, history is strange. Coffee history is even stranger. I'm not sure the truth behind this amazing moment in coffee history, but I'm happy that I get to explore it years later with my audience, who I love dearly, at my own leisure, in any coffee house that I so choose, probably with free internet too. Thank you all for listening. I appreciate you. This was a very interesting one. I hope you enjoyed it. Happy Independence Day. It's the 4th weekend. I hope you have a great one. Take care, everybody. I'll see you next time on the Coffee, Health, and Science podcast. This is Jordan River signing off, saying have an extraordinary day. We'll see you next time on the CHSP. Bye-bye.